October 14th, 1973, Glendale, California. When emergency responders burst through the door of a modest suburban home on Elm Street, they found Ronald Kendrick lying motionless in his bedroom. His wife Patricia stood in the corner, mascara streaking her carefully made-up face. "The spiders," she whispered, pointing to the darkened closet. "They came at night." The attending physician noted the unusual markings on Ronald's abdomen, 2 puncture wounds, darkened tissue spreading necrosis. "Black widow bites," Patricia insisted. The garage had been infested for weeks. She'd warned him to call an exterminator. He never listened. But when the coroner's assistant rolled Ronald's body onto its side during the preliminary examination, something caught the fluorescent light. A tiny needle mark, fresh and precise, hidden beneath the 5th rib. And in Patricia's bathroom, behind a loose tile investigators would discover 3 days later, sat a small glass vial, empty. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about Patricia Kendrick and the twisted web of murder she spun across Southern California, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's darkest corners. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now, let's step back into 1973, when one woman's carefully constructed lies began to unravel. The early 1970s in Southern California represented a peculiar contradiction in American life. While the counterculture movement preached free love and communal living just miles away in San Francisco, the sprawling suburbs of Los Angeles County remained bastions of traditional values. Women were expected to maintain perfect homes, prepare elaborate dinners, and support their husbands' careers with unwavering devotion. The feminist movement was gaining momentum, yes, but in neighborhoods like Glendale, change arrived slowly, reluctantly. Patricia Ann Morrison had embraced this traditional role with enthusiasm when she married Ronald Kendrick in 1967. At 23, she possessed the kind of beauty that turned heads at the supermarket, dark hair styled in perfect waves, green eyes that sparkled when she laughed, a figure maintained through meticulous calorie counting. Ronald, 8 years her senior, worked as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical distribution company. He traveled frequently, sometimes for weeks at a time, leaving Patricia alone in their 3-bedroom ranch house. Their neighborhood exemplified post-war American prosperity. Manicured lawns stretched in geometric perfection. Station wagons sat in driveways. Children rode bicycles in endless loops around cul-de-sacs. On weekends, the smell of charcoal grills drifted through the warm air, while men discussed baseball scores and women traded recipes over sweating glasses of iced tea. But beneath Glendale's placid surface, something darker festered. The pharmaceutical industry had exploded throughout the 1960s, and with it came unprecedented access to powerful medications. Ronald's position gave him keys to warehouses stocked with everything from antibiotics to sedatives to experimental compounds, not yet approved for public use. He brought samples home frequently: headache tablets for Patricia, sleeping pills when her insomnia flared, vitamins they both took religiously each morning. Patricia had grown up poor in rural Oklahoma, the youngest of 6 children raised by a single mother who cleaned houses for wealthy families. She'd learned early that survival required careful observation, strategic planning, and the ability to become whatever others needed her to be. When she met Ronald at a church social in Tulsa, she recognized her ticket out. She laughed at his jokes, admired his ambition, and within 6 months, they were married in a small ceremony her family couldn't afford to attend. The first 3 years of marriage passed unremarkably. Patricia joined the ladies' auxiliary at church, hosted dinner parties for Ronald's colleagues, and decorated their home with the meticulous attention to detail she'd learned watching the wealthy women her mother had served. But Ronald's frequent absences began to wear on her. The loneliness grew suffocating. The suburbs' rigid social hierarchies meant she was always an outsider. The girl from Oklahoma who'd married up, whose accent occasionally slipped through her carefully cultivated speech. And then Patricia met Thomas Hargrove at a company picnic in July 1972. Thomas worked as a sales representative under Ronald, 10 years younger, and possessed of an easy charm that made Patricia feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Their affair began innocently enough: coffee meetings that stretched into lunch, afternoon conversations that grew increasingly intimate. By October, they were meeting at a motel off the highway 3 times a week, while Ronald traveled for work. Thomas wanted her to leave Ronald. Patricia wanted more than a divorce could provide. She'd built this life brick by brick, and she wasn't about to walk away from the house, the social standing, the financial security. But Ronald had grown suspicious. He'd started coming home unexpectedly, checking the odometer on her car, questioning her about her days. The walls were closing in. In the garage, black widows had indeed made nests among the stored boxes and gardening equipment. Patricia had noticed them months earlier, and in noticing them, she'd found her solution: escalating incidents. The first incident occurred on March 3, 1973, though no one recognized it as such at the time. Ronald complained of severe stomach cramps during dinner, his face draining of color as waves of nausea forced him to excuse himself from the table. Patricia found him an hour later, collapsed on the bathroom floor, too weak to stand. She called their family physician, Dr. Howard Marsh, who made a rare house call given Ronald's condition. Probably food poisoning, Dr. Marsh concluded after a brief examination. There's a nasty strain going around. Keep him hydrated and call me if the fever spikes above 102. He left a prescription for anti-nausea medication and departed, never suspecting that the food poisoning had come from a carefully measured dose of arsenic trioxide Patricia had stirred into Ronald's evening coffee. Ronald recovered within 3 days, though he remained weak. Patricia doted on him during his convalescence, bringing him soup and crackers, adjusting his pillows, expressing her deep concern to neighbors who stopped by with well wishes. "I was so frightened," she told Mrs. Henderson from next door, tears welling convincingly in her eyes. "I thought I might lose him." The second incident came on May 19th. Ronald had been back at work for only a week when he suffered what appeared to be a severe allergic reaction. His lips swelled, hives erupted across his chest and arms, and his breathing became labored. Patricia rushed him to Glendale Memorial Hospital, where emergency room physicians administered epinephrine and antihistamines. The episode passed within hours. "Have you changed detergents recently?" the attending physician asked Patricia in a waiting room. "Tried any new foods?" "Nothing," Patricia insisted. "Everything's been exactly the same. I can't imagine what could have caused this." The medical staff concluded it was an idiopathic reaction, one of those mysterious immune responses that sometimes occur without clear cause. They sent Ronald home with an EpiPen and instructions to avoid anything unusual. The small puncture wound on his upper arm, barely visible, was attributed to the IV needle they'd used during treatment. What hospital staff didn't know was that Patricia had spent 3 weeks researching allergens and histamine reactions at the Glendale Public Library, taking copious notes on compounds that could trigger anaphylactic shock. The injection she'd administered while Ronald slept contained a concentrated dose of wasp venom, carefully extracted from specimens she'd collected in glass jars and stored beneath the bathroom sink. Between these dramatic incidents, Ronald experienced a constellation of smaller symptoms: persistent headaches that forced him to leave work early, dizzy spells that made driving dangerous, episodes of confusion where he'd forget entire conversations or lose track of time. His colleagues noticed the changes. "Ron just isn't himself lately," his secretary mentioned to Patricia during a company function. "Is everything all right at home?" "We're managing," Patricia replied with a brave smile. "The doctors think it might be stress-related. You know how hard he works." By July, Ronald's physician had referred him to a neurologist, Dr. Ellen Kaufman, who specialized in mysterious neurological conditions. Dr. Kaufman ordered extensive testing, blood work, CT scans, and EEG to measure brain activity. Everything came back normal, within acceptable ranges. "I'm not finding any organic cause for your symptoms," Dr. Kaufman told Ronald during his follow-up appointment. "Have you considered that stress might be a significant factor? Your wife mentioned you travel extensively for work." Ronald nodded, exhausted. The past months had felt like living in a fog. Simple tasks required enormous effort. He'd lost 15 pounds, his clothes hanging loose on his diminishing frame. "Maybe I need to slow down," he conceded. "Take some time off." Patricia encouraged this idea enthusiastically. More time at home meant more opportunities, though she had to be careful. The spacing between incidents had to seem random, natural. She varied her methods. Sometimes arsenic in his food, sometimes sedatives dissolved in his morning orange juice, once a near-miss accident when the brakes on his car failed on the highway. That accident in late August almost worked. Ronald's car had veered off Highway 134, crashing through a guardrail and tumbling 15 feet down an embankment. He'd survived with only minor injuries: bruised ribs, a concussion, lacerations requiring stitches. When Highway Patrol examined the vehicle, they found evidence that the brake line had been compromised, but they attributed it to corrosion and wear. Ronald's car was 7 years old after all. "You're the luckiest man alive," the responding officer told Ronald as paramedics loaded him into an ambulance. Patricia, who'd received the call at home and rushed to the hospital, sobbed into Ronald's shoulder. "I could have lost you," she wept. "I don't know what I'd do without you." But luck, Patricia was learning, was an unreliable accomplice. Each failed attempt increased the risk of discovery. The medical community in Glendale was small, and doctors were beginning to discuss Ronald's case at their monthly meetings. Dr. Kaufman had mentioned to Dr. Marsh that the pattern of symptoms seemed unusual, almost toxicological. Neither physician wanted to voice their growing suspicion that someone might be deliberately harming Ronald Kendrick, but the thought had begun to take root. Thomas Hargrove was growing impatient as well. He'd promised Patricia he would wait, that they'd be together once Ronald was gone, but the delays frustrated him. "How much longer?" he demanded during one of their afternoon meetings at the Starlight Motel. "You keep saying soon, but nothing changes." "These things take time," Patricia insisted. "It has to look natural. If there's any suspicion, we lose everything." In early September, Patricia discovered the Black Widows. She'd gone to the garage searching for a box of seasonal decorations when she noticed the distinctive webbing in the corner. Irregular and chaotic. Moving closer, she spotted 3 of the spiders, glossy black bodies marked with the telltale red hourglass. Most people would have called an exterminator immediately. Patricia saw an opportunity. She began documenting the infestation meticulously. She took photographs with her Polaroid camera, showing Ronald the images and expressing concern. "We really should have someone come spray," she told him repeatedly. Ronald, overwhelmed by his deteriorating health and work obligations, kept postponing the call. Patricia purchased books on venomous spiders from the library. She left them conspicuously on the coffee table, marking pages about Black Widow symptoms. She mentioned the spiders to neighbors, to the postal carrier, to the clerk at the grocery store. "I'm terrified of them," she said again and again. "Ronald keeps saying he'll handle it, but you know how men are about these things." She was building her alibi, brick by brick, conversation by conversation. When the final act came, everyone would remember that Patricia Kendrick had been warning about spiders for weeks. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button and let us know in the comments what you think Patricia's next move will be. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries and psychological thrillers. The truth gets even darker from here. Let's discover what happens next in this twisted tale of manipulation and murder. October 13, 1973, 11:47 p.m. Patricia Kendrick dialed emergency services with trembling fingers. The dispatcher later reported that her voice was barely audible, punctuated by gasping sobs. "My husband," Patricia managed between breaths. "He's not breathing. Please, you have to hurry. The spiders, I think it was the spiders." Emergency medical technician David Rodriguez and his partner arrived at 11:54 p.m. They found Patricia in the living room, her negligee torn at the shoulder, her hair disheveled. She pointed toward the bedroom, unable to speak. Rodriguez entered first, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Ronald Kendrick lay sprawled across the bed, one arm hanging limply over the side. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, lips slightly parted. Rodriguez checked for a pulse, finding nothing. He began CPR while his partner radioed for additional support, but they both recognized the signs of a body that had been dead for at least an hour. The skin was cool to the touch, lividity already settling in the lowest points. "Ma'am, I need you to tell me exactly what happened," Rodriguez said gently after calling time of death at 12:03 a.m. Patricia was sitting on the living room sofa, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders provided by a responding police officer. Her story came out in fragments, perfectly calibrated for maximum sympathy. She'd been watching television in the living room while Ronald went to bed early, complaining of exhaustion. Around 10:30, she'd heard a crash from the bedroom, Ronald knocking over the lamp on his nightstand. She'd run in to find him convulsing on the bed, his face contorted in agony. "He was clutching his stomach," Patricia told Rodriguez. "He kept saying it burned, that something was burning inside him." She'd seen the spiders then, she claimed. 2 of them scurrying across the bedspread, Black Widows. She'd screamed, tried to help Ronald, but he'd lost consciousness within minutes. She'd been too panicked to call for help immediately, had tried to revive him herself, wasted precious minutes in shock and terror. "The spiders," she kept repeating. I told him we needed to get rid of them." The responding police officer, Sergeant Michael Torres, conducted a preliminary walkthrough of the house while EMTs prepared to transport Ronald's body to the morgue. In the garage, he found the spider nests Patricia had described, exactly where she'd said they'd be. In the bedroom, he discovered 2 Black Widows, just as Patricia had claimed, though they seemed lethargic, moving slowly. Everything matched Patricia's story. Almost everything. Dr. James Chen, the medical examiner who performed the initial examination at Glendale Memorial Hospital's morgue, noted several peculiarities in his preliminary report. Yes, Ronald Kendrick displayed some symptoms consistent with black widow envenomation, abdominal rigidity, elevated creatine kinase levels suggesting muscle breakdown. But other findings troubled him. The 2 puncture wounds Patricia had pointed out to emergency responders, allegedly spider bites, were too far apart. Black widow fangs typically left marks 1–2 millimeters apart. These were separated by nearly a centimeter. The wounds were also too deep, too clean, more consistent with a hypodermic needle than with arachnid chelicerae. Dr. Chen examined every inch of Ronald's body under bright surgical lights. That's when he found it, the 3rd puncture mark, hidden beneath the 5th rib on Ronald's left side. This one was fresh, administered within hours of death. It angled upward, toward the heart, a trajectory that suggested deliberate targeting rather than defensive spider behavior. He drew blood samples, tissue samples, fluid from Ronald's vitreous humor. He photographed everything, documenting each anomaly. At 3:17 a.m. on October 14th, he called Sergeant Torres at home. "Don't let that widow leave town," Dr. Chen said, his choice of words deliberate. This wasn't spiders, this was murder. The investigation accelerated rapidly. At 6:00 a.m., Detective Linda Vasquez of the Glendale Police Department arrived at the Kendrick home with a search warrant. Patricia, who'd finally fallen asleep on the sofa around 4:00 a.m., answered the door in confusion and growing alarm. "I don't understand," she said as officers began methodically searching the house. "Ronald died from spider bites. Why are you doing this?" "We have some questions about your husband's death," Detective Vasquez explained, her tone professional but not unkind. "We need to examine the house thoroughly. Standard procedure." Officer Jennifer Walsh was the one who found the loose tile in the master bathroom. She'd been checking the medicine cabinet when she noticed the grout around one tile looked disturbed, recently replaced. Using a putty knife, she carefully pried it free. Behind the tile sat a small cavity, roughly 6 inches deep. Inside, a glass vial, empty but residue still visible in the bottom. A box of hypodermic needles, 3 missing from the original dozen. A small notebook filled with Patricia's meticulous handwriting. Dates, dosages, observations about Ronald's reactions to various compounds. "Detective," Walsh called out, her voice steady despite the electricity of discovery. "You need to see this." Patricia was in the kitchen when Walsh emerged with the evidence bag. The color drained from her face as she saw the notebook, her carefully constructed facade finally cracking. She tried to run, made it 3 steps toward the back door before Detective Vasquez caught her arm. "Patricia Kendrick, you're under arrest for the murder of Ronald Kendrick," Vasquez said, turning Patricia to face her. "You have the right to remain silent." In the notebook, investigators would later discover a horrifying chronology. Patricia had been poisoning her husband for 7 months, using compounds stolen from the pharmaceutical warehouse where Ronald worked. She documented each attempt, noting what worked and what didn't, adjusting dosages like a scientist conducting experiments. The final entry, dated October 13th, read, "Potassium chloride 40 ml direct cardiac injection, combined with diazepam predose to ensure unconsciousness. Spider staging complete." The glass vial, once sent to the lab, contained traces of potassium chloride, a compound that stops the heart and dissipates quickly in the bloodstream, making it difficult to detect in standard toxicology screens. Patricia had injected it directly into Ronald's heart while he slept, sedated by the diazepam she'd dissolved in his evening tea. The black widows in the garage were real, but Patricia had been cultivating them, keeping them contained, waiting for the perfect moment to deploy them as camouflage for murder. The 2 spiders found in the bedroom had been placed there deliberately, released from a jar after Ronald was already dead. She'd thought of everything, almost everything. She hadn't counted on the medical examiner's meticulous attention to detail, or the precise spacing of her needle marks, or the fact that truth has a way of revealing itself no matter how carefully lies are constructed. At the police station, Patricia initially maintained her innocence, but as evidence mounted, her story began to shift. First, she claimed Ronald had been abusive, that she'd acted in self-defense over time. When investigators found no evidence of abuse, Ronald's medical records showed no defensive wounds. Neighbors described him as gentle and devoted. She changed tactics again. "He was controlling," she insisted. "He isolated me. I had no choice." But the affair with Thomas Hargrove, which police discovered through phone records and motel registries, painted a different picture. This wasn't a battered woman escaping abuse. This was a calculated killer who wanted her husband's life insurance policy, his house, and his retirement savings, without the complications of divorce. Investigation. The prosecution of Patricia Kendrick became one of the most closely watched criminal trials in Southern California history. District Attorney Robert Mendoza, who'd built his career on high-profile cases, personally led the prosecution team. He understood that proving premeditated murder required more than physical evidence. He needed to establish motive, opportunity, and a pattern of behavior that demonstrated Patricia's calculated nature. The trial began on March 4, 1974, at the Superior Court of California, County of Los Angeles. Judge Margaret Thornton presided, known for her no-nonsense approach and sharp legal mind. The courtroom was packed every day, journalists filling the gallery, sketch artists capturing Patricia's composed expression as she sat beside her defense attorney, Marcus Webb. Webb had taken the case pro bono, attracted by its complexity and the challenge of defending the indefensible. His strategy centered on portraying Patricia as a victim of circumstance, a woman trapped in an unhappy marriage, driven to desperate measures by years of emotional neglect. He planned to argue that even if Patricia had hastened Ronald's death, it wasn't first-degree murder but rather a crime of passion born from sustained psychological trauma. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically. Dr. James Chen testified for 3 hours, explaining in clinical detail how he'd identified the inconsistencies in Ronald's death. Using enlarged photographs of the puncture wounds, he demonstrated the geometric impossibilities of Patricia's spider bite claims. "The spacing is wrong, the depth is wrong, the location is wrong," he told the jury. "These wounds were made by a needle, administered by someone with at least basic knowledge of human anatomy." The toxicology reports revealed traces of 7 different compounds in Ronald's system: arsenic, potassium chloride, diazepam, wasp venom proteins, and others. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the forensic toxicologist who'd analyzed the samples, explained that the combination and sequence of poisons suggested a sophisticated understanding of pharmacology. "This wasn't a desperate act," she testified. "This was a systematic campaign to kill someone while evading detection." Perhaps the most damaging evidence came from Patricia's own notebook. Prosecutor Mendoza read selected passages aloud, his voice heavy with disgust. March 3, 15 mg arsenic trioxide in evening coffee. Onset in 2 hours. Symptoms lasted 72 hours but insufficient for lethality. Must increase dosage or try alternative method. May 19th. Wasp venom extract, 2 ml subcutaneous injection while subject sleeping. Anaphylactic response promising but medical intervention too rapid. Need faster acting agent. August 24th. Compromised brake line. Result, vehicle accident. Subject survived. Too unpredictable, cannot control outcome sufficiently. The jury sat in horrified silence as Mendoza continued through months of entries, each one detailing another attempt on Ronald's life, each one demonstrating Patricia's cold, scientific approach to murder. Thomas Hargrove's testimony proved equally devastating. The prosecution had granted him immunity in exchange for his cooperation, and he took the stand looking 20 years older than his 35 years. Under oath, he described his affair with Patricia and her increasingly explicit discussions about life after Ronald's death. "She talked about it constantly," Thomas testified, unable to meet Patricia's eyes across the courtroom. "At first I thought she was just fantasizing, imagining being free. But then she started getting specific. She'd say things like, 'When Ron's gone, we'll take his life insurance money and move to Mexico. No one will ever find us.'" Defense attorney Webb attempted to paint Thomas as an opportunist who'd manipulated Patricia's affections and planted ideas about eliminating her husband. But Thomas's phone records, introduced as evidence, showed that Patricia had initiated almost all of their contact. She'd called him dozens of times from payphones around Glendale, taking care never to use her home phone where records might trace the conversations. The prosecution called 43 witnesses over 6 weeks. Neighbors testified about Patricia's complaints regarding the spiders, establishing her careful preparation of the alibi. Ronald's colleagues described his progressive deterioration, symptoms they attributed to stress, but now understood as evidence of chronic poisoning. The warehouse manager at Ronald's pharmaceutical distribution company confirmed that inventory discrepancies had been noted over the past year. Small amounts of various compounds gone missing, never enough to trigger a formal investigation. Medical witnesses painted a portrait of Ronald's final months that horrified the jury. Dr. Ellen Kaufman, Ronald's neurologist, testified that she'd begun to suspect poisoning but had hesitated to voice her concerns without proof. "I documented everything unusual," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "In the back of my mind, I knew something was terribly wrong. I just couldn't believe someone would do this to their spouse." The defense strategy collapsed under the weight of evidence. Webb attempted to introduce testimony about Patricia's difficult childhood, her mother's testimony about the poverty and instability Patricia had endured. But Judge Thornton limited such testimony, ruling it had limited relevance to the charges. Patricia's past struggles, tragic as they might be, didn't justify 7 months of methodical murder attempts. On April 19, 1974, after 11 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The forewoman, a retired schoolteacher named Dorothy Adams, read the decision in a clear, steady voice. "We find the defendant, Patricia Ann Kendrick, guilty of murder in the first degree with special circumstances." Patricia showed no emotion as the verdict was read, though her attorney later reported that she'd gripped his arm with enough force to leave bruises. The special circumstances finding, murder for financial gain and murder by poisoning, made her eligible for the death penalty under California law. The sentencing phase began 2 weeks later. Prosecutor Mendoza argued passionately for capital punishment, describing Patricia's crimes as among the most cold-blooded he'd encountered in 20 years of practice. "She didn't kill in a moment of rage," he told the court. "She killed slowly, methodically, documenting her husband's suffering like a scientist taking notes. She watched him deteriorate, comforted him through symptoms she'd caused, and then tried again. That's not murder, that's torture." Webb, in his final argument, appealed to mercy. He portrayed Patricia as a product of her circumstances, a woman who'd never learned healthy ways to cope with unhappiness. "Yes, she committed terrible acts," he conceded, "but executing her doesn't serve justice. It merely adds another death to this tragedy." Judge Thornton delivered her sentence on May 7, 1974. She acknowledged the brutality of Patricia's crimes but cited her age and lack of prior criminal history as mitigating factors. "Patricia Kendrick," she pronounced, "you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. You will spend the remainder of your natural life contemplating the consequences of your actions." Patricia was remanded to the California Institution for Women in Corona, where she would spend the next 50 years. Prison records indicate she was a model inmate, working in the prison library and maintaining an impeccable disciplinary record. She gave several interviews over the decades, always maintaining a version of events that portrayed her as more victim than perpetrator. In a 1989 interview with criminologist Dr. Helen Park, Patricia offered her most revealing comments about the murders. "I didn't see Ronald as a person anymore. He'd become an obstacle, a problem to solve. I approached it like I approached everything else, methodically, carefully. I suppose that's what made it so shocking to people. Women aren't supposed to be calculating. We're supposed to be emotional, impulsive. I was neither." The case had immediate ripple effects throughout California's medical and legal communities. Hospitals began implementing new protocols for unexplained illnesses, particularly when patients showed combinations of symptoms that didn't fit standard diagnostic patterns. Medical examiners received training in identifying poisoning cases that might otherwise be attributed to natural causes or accidents. The pharmaceutical industry tightened security around controlled substances. Ronald's employer, Meditech Distribution, implemented new inventory systems and random audits after investigators revealed how easy it had been for Patricia to steal compounds from warehouse supplies. Ronald brought home. Law enforcement agencies created task forces specifically focused on domestic poisoning cases. Detective Linda Vasquez, who'd led the Kendrick investigation, became a nationally recognized expert on spousal murder by poisoning. She lectured at police academies across the country, teaching investigators to recognize the warning signs, unexplained illnesses, patterns of symptoms that intensified when the victim was home, sudden recoveries when the victim was away from the spouse. Thomas Hargrove disappeared from public life after the trial. He changed his name and moved to Oregon, according to sources close to the case. He never married, reportedly haunted by his role in Ronald's death. While he hadn't administered any poisons himself, he'd known about Patricia's plans and had done nothing to stop them, a moral failure he carried for the rest of his life. The Kendrick home on Elm Street in Glendale stood empty for 2 years before finally selling at a significant loss. The new owners, unaware of the property's history, lived there for 3 years before learning about the murder. They sold immediately, unable to reconcile their pleasant suburban home with the horror that had unfolded within its walls. Ronald's family, his parents and 2 siblings, filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Patricia in 1975, winning a judgment of $2.3 million. Since Patricia had no assets beyond what she'd inherited from Ronald's estate, the family placed liens on those assets, ensuring she would never benefit financially from her crimes. The money was eventually donated to domestic violence prevention organizations, a cause Ronald's mother felt honored. Her son's memory, despite the irony that he hadn't been a victim of traditional domestic violence. The black widow spiders that had played such a crucial role in Patricia's alibi became an unexpected symbol of the case. Entomologist Dr. Marcus Webb, no relation to Patricia's attorney, published a paper titled Arachnids and Alibis, The Kendrick Case and the Misuse of Natural History in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. He detailed how Patricia's understanding of black widow behavior had been both sophisticated and flawed, noting that her attempt to stage the scene would have been more convincing if she'd known that black widows rarely bite humans, unless directly threatened, and almost never leave their webs to crawl on beds. Broader implications. The Patricia Kendrick case forced American society to confront uncomfortable truths about domestic murder, gender expectations, and the invisible violence that can exist behind closed doors. For decades, the archetype of the murderous wife had been the crime of passion, the woman who snaps after years of abuse, who strikes out in a moment of desperation. Patricia represented something far more disturbing, the calculating female killer who weaponized domesticity itself. Feminist scholars found themselves in a complex position regarding the case. On one hand, Patricia's crimes reinforced dangerous stereotypes about women as manipulative and deceptive. On the other hand, her methodical approach and scientific precision demonstrated capabilities society typically attributed only to male criminals. Dr. Margaret Atwell, a sociologist at UCLA, wrote in 1976, "Patricia Kendrick terrifies us, not because she's a woman who killed, but because she killed in ways we've convinced ourselves women cannot. She was patient, calculating, emotionless, all traits we associate with male criminality. Her existence challenges our fundamental assumptions about gender and violence." The case contributed to a growing awareness of poisoning as a method of domestic murder. Historically, poison had been called the woman's weapon, and cases like Patricia's reinforced why. Poison required no physical strength, left no signs of struggle, and could be administered in the intimate context of caregiving, preparing meals, serving drinks, tending to an ill spouse. It was murder disguised as devotion. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, still in its early years in the 1970s, incorporated the Kendrick case into their developing profiles of female serial killers. Agent Robert Ressler, who would later become famous for coining the term serial killer, interviewed Patricia in 1978 as part of his research. He noted in his report, "Subject displays classic narcissistic traits combined with complete absence of empathy. She views people as objects to be manipulated toward her desired outcomes. Her gender is almost incidental to her psychology. She would have been dangerous regardless." Medical training programs began incorporating Kendrick protocols into their curricula by the late 1970s. Young doctors learned to be alert for poisoning cases presenting as mysterious illnesses. They studied Ronald's medical records, noting the constellation of symptoms that should have triggered suspicion earlier. Dr. Ellen Kaufman became a vocal advocate for this training, carrying guilt for the rest of her career that she hadn't identified the poisoning before it proved fatal. The case also highlighted vulnerabilities in the pharmaceutical supply chain. Ronald's position had given him access to substances that should have been more carefully controlled. Congressional hearings in 1975 led to the Drug Security Act, which mandated stricter inventory controls and accountability for pharmaceutical distributions. Company employees could no longer bring samples home without documentation, and warehouses had to maintain detailed logs of every compound entering or leaving their facilities. Perhaps most significantly, the Kendrick case contributed to changing attitudes about toxicology in forensic investigations. Before Patricia's prosecution, many medical examiners conducted only basic toxicology screens looking for common substances like alcohol or opiates. The discovery of 7 different poisons in Ronald's system demonstrated the need for more comprehensive testing. By 1980, most major medical examiner offices had expanded their toxicology capabilities, able to detect dozens of compounds that might indicate foul play. The case revealed disturbing statistics about domestic poisoning. Researchers estimated that for every Patricia Kendrick who was caught, dozens of similar cases went undetected. When someone died at home after a prolonged illness, especially if they were under a doctor's care, autopsies were rarely performed. Cremation destroyed evidence before investigations could begin. The true scope of spousal poisoning, experts concluded, might never be known. Insurance companies began implementing new investigative protocols after the Kendrick case. When beneficiaries filed claims on policies exceeding certain amounts, particularly if the deceased had been young or recently experienced mysterious health problems, insurers now conducted more thorough investigations. Patricia's attempt to collect $500,000 from Ronald's life insurance policy had nearly succeeded. Only the medical examiner's suspicions had prevented the check from being issued. Support groups for families of murder victims began addressing a new category of survivors, those who'd lost loved ones to slow, hidden violence. The traditional grief of sudden violent death was complicated when families realized their loved one had suffered for months, while those closest to them remained oblivious. Ronald's parents both required extensive therapy to cope with guilt over not recognizing that their son was being murdered over Sunday dinners and holiday visits. The case also sparked discussions about psychopathy in women, a subject that had received little serious academic attention before the 1970s. Most research on psychopathic personalities had focused on male subjects, assuming women lacked the capacity for such cold, calculating violence. Patricia's case, along with several others that came to light in the mid-1970s, forced researchers to reconsider these assumptions. Dr. Martha Stout's groundbreaking 1982 study, The Sociopath Next Door, devoted an entire chapter to female psychopaths, using Patricia as a primary case study. By the 1980s, the term Black Widow killer had entered popular lexicon, referring to women who murdered multiple spouses or partners for financial gain. The name, derived from the spider that mates and then kills, proved grimly appropriate. Researchers identified patterns across cases: the apparent devotion, the careful documentation of the victim's declining health to medical professionals, the construction of elaborate alibis. Patricia Kendrick became the prototype against which other cases were measured. The legal implications extended beyond criminal law into insurance policy and contract law. Courts began recognizing slayer rules more consistently, provisions that prevented murderers from profiting from their crimes through inheritance or insurance. California strengthened its slayer statute in 1976, making it explicit that anyone convicted of murdering a family member forfeited all rights to that person's estate, insurance proceeds, or survivor benefits. Patricia's case had been the catalyst. Mental health professionals struggled with questions the case raised about prevention and early intervention. Could Patricia's potential for violence have been identified earlier? Her childhood poverty and instability had left emotional scars, but millions of people overcame difficult childhoods without becoming killers. Her narcissistic traits and lack of empathy might have been evident to a trained observer, but she never sought therapy or exhibited behavior that would have brought her to clinical attention. The uncomfortable truth was that people like Patricia often functioned successfully in society right up until the moment they didn't. True crime media exploded in the 1980s and 1990s, and the Kendrick case became a staple of the genre. It appeared in countless books, television documentaries, and eventually podcasts. Each retelling emphasized different aspects. Some focused on the investigative process, others on the psychological profile, still others on the victim's perspective. Ronald's story, his slow deterioration while trusting the woman who was killing him, resonated with audiences as a particularly cruel betrayal of marital intimacy. The case influenced popular culture beyond true crime. Several novels and films drew inspiration from Patricia's methodical approach to murder, though creators often changed details to avoid direct legal challenges. The 1985 thriller Fatal Devotion centered on a pharmacist's wife who uses her access to medications to eliminate obstacles to her happiness. The 1992 made-for-TV movie The Spider's Web dramatized a case clearly based on Patricia's story, though names and locations were altered. Criminologists studying the case identified what they termed the Kendrick paradox, the contradiction between Patricia's meticulous planning and her ultimate carelessness. She'd thought through dozens of details, maintained her alibi over months, documented everything with scientific precision. Yet she'd also kept that documentation in an easily discoverable location, used needle punctures too obviously different from spider bites, and left a clear trail of motive through her affair with Thomas Hargrove. Dr. David Carlson, who specialized in criminal psychology, theorized in his 1988 analysis, Patricia suffered from a common delusion among intelligent criminals. She believed she was smarter than everyone else. This arrogance created blind spots. She couldn't imagine that others might be as observant and careful as she was. The case also contributed to evolving understanding of financial murder as distinct from other domestic violence. While Patricia might have claimed emotional abuse or neglect as motivations, the evidence overwhelmingly indicated that money was her primary driver. She wanted Ronald's assets without the complications of divorce, which would have meant splitting property and possibly paying alimony given that Ronald was the primary earner. The $500,000 life insurance policy, the house, Ronald's retirement accounts, together they represented financial security Patricia refused to surrender. By the 2000s, medical examiners had protocols specifically designed to catch Kendrick-style poisonings. When someone died at home after prolonged mysterious illness, particularly if under age 65, comprehensive toxicology screens became standard. The tests looked for dozens of compounds including arsenic, various sedatives, potassium chloride, and other substances that could indicate poisoning. Detection technology had improved dramatically since 1973, making it nearly impossible for modern-day Patricia Kendricks to evade discovery. The case remained relevant in the 21st century as discussions about intimate partner violence evolved. Researchers noted that while most domestic violence involved male perpetrators and female victims, cases like Patricia's demonstrated that violence within relationships could flow in any direction. Gender-neutral language in domestic violence laws and support services partly emerged from recognition that assumptions about who could be victim and who perpetrator were dangerously limiting. Educational programs for medical professionals now include the Kendrick case as a teaching tool. Medical students study Ronald's progression of symptoms, learning to identify patterns that suggest intentional poisoning rather than organic illness. The key indicators: symptoms that appear and disappear without clear medical explanation, multiple organ systems affected simultaneously, improvement when away from a particular environment or person, and resistance to standard treatments. Law enforcement training similarly incorporated lessons from the investigation. Detective Linda Vasquez's careful, methodical approach, searching for physical evidence while building a timeline of suspicious events, became a model for investigating complex domestic crimes. Her decision to seek a search warrant based on the medical examiner's suspicions, rather than accepting the spider bite narrative at face value, demonstrated the importance of questioning convenient explanations. Perhaps the most lasting impact was on how society understands the capacity for evil within ordinary life. Patricia Kendrick looked like everyone's neighbor, everyone's friend at church, everyone's fellow volunteer at the school bake sale. She was attractive, articulate, socially adept. Nothing about her appearance or manner suggested she was capable of slowly murdering her husband while documenting his deterioration in a hidden notebook. The cognitive dissonance between who Patricia appeared to be and what she actually was forced people to confront uncomfortable realities about human nature. The case also highlighted how isolation and desperation, even when self-imposed, could warp moral reasoning. Patricia had felt trapped not by external constraints, but by her own unwillingness to accept a life different from what she'd envisioned. Rather than adapt her expectations or make difficult choices like divorce, she'd chosen murder. That decision revealed something profound about her character, but it also raised questions about the pressures suburban domesticity placed on women in the 1970s. The expectation of perfect contentment, the social stigma of divorce, the equation of material success with personal worth. Patricia Kendrick died in prison on January 8, 2024, at the age of 80. She was found unresponsive in her cell at the California Institution for Women, having suffered a massive stroke. She'd spent 50 years behind bars, longer than she'd lived in freedom. In her final interview, conducted just months before her death, she was asked if she felt remorse for killing Ronald. Her response was characteristically revealing: "I regret getting caught. I regret the methods that failed. I don't regret trying to build a better life for myself." That chilling lack of remorse, maintained across 5 decades, speaks to something fundamentally broken in Patricia's capacity for human connection. She never saw Ronald as a person, only as an obstacle. She never understood that love, real love, doesn't calculate costs and benefits or plan exit strategies. To the very end, she remained the woman who'd hidden poison behind a bathroom tile and called it problem-solving. What do you think drove Patricia Kendrick to such calculated evil? Was it her difficult childhood, her narcissistic personality, or simply the belief that she deserved what Ronald had, and she was willing to do anything to take it? Leave your theories in the comments below. We love hearing different perspectives from our community of mystery seekers. If you found this deep dive into one of America's most chilling cases of domestic murder fascinating, make sure you're subscribed to Fear Sermon and have notifications turned on. We bring you the forgotten chapters of history, the cases that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and the monsters who hide behind ordinary faces. Share this video with someone who appreciates true crime done right, researched thoroughly, presented respectfully with focus on understanding not just what happened but why. Next week we're covering another case that will keep you awake at night, another story of secrets and lies that finally came to light. Until then, remember, evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it sits across from you at the breakfast table, smiles, and asks if you'd like more coffee. See you in the next video.